Maureen is a wonderful person. She works down at the archives as a volunteer, right, Maureen? Yeah, so, and for many years, correct. 17 years volunteering at the archives. Yes, combing through monotonous tasks, and what she has come up with is a wealth of information, and we're really excited to bring her up here, and she's going to share with us a bit about Altaville and Angels Camp. And so, yes, a warm welcome for Maureen. And
he didn't warn me that there's a big group. So I thought we'd start with a little bit of Altaville. And what I was surprised about with Altaville is it was mostly mines. I always thought Angels Camp were the mines, but Altaville was all mines all the way down the highway. So the picture you see up there on the left is the Prince Building. And as you look further down the road on the right, that would all be the buildings where Bret Harte High School probably owns most of those now. They're all, long gone. You can see the foundry, the little white building on the right, on the left-hand side down there, and everything else is gone. And that's why you have a lot of empty lots in Altaville. The old mining grounds, they've got nothing built on them yet. So the first thing, I keep walking away from this, sorry. The first thing in Altaville was the Cherokee House, which was where the tractor supply place is now. It was a roadside house, a bar, a saloon, and it was owned by William Bean in 1850, long before there was anything else. William Bean was a member of the Cherokee Nation. There were quite a few of the Cherokee Nation here. And when he sold it, I guess what you'd call criminals bought it, and it became one of those hangouts that you didn't want to go near. And there were quite a few people hung on the tree, lynched on the tree outside by lawmen. So after that ended, Peter Miller and his wife Mary bought it, and they lived there as their house. It burnt down in, if I remember right, 1908. And sadly, there's no photos, not that I know of anyway. Why is this not? Come on, there we go. There we go. You can see the Prince Building over on the left again. And you can see some cars down on the right. Those cars are right at the edge of the grade road where that drive-through coffee place is now. And that was the Altaville Hotel. You can kind of see a two-story. And again, the white roof building, the light color on the left, that's where the foundries were. I lost it. There we go. The Prince Building, he built it with a partner, Garibaldi, David Garibaldi, but Garibaldi and a lot of other Italians went back to Italy in 1862. I think there was some kind of fighting going on over there that they were getting into from what I heard. But Mr. Prince stayed, had a large family. He was the coroner as well, and you can see the coroner's office. It was right next to the stone building at that time. And it says coroner and morgue on it. So he was kind of multi-function, and he had a store, a bar, a saloon, a livery stable, owned a hotel, and he was the coroner. And I'm having trouble getting this to, there it went. That's the livery stable he owned. The building you can see behind that livery stable, that's the Altaville Hotel. Oh, okay, what have we got there? Got rid of it. Yeah. And the Altaville Hotel was, like I said, on the corner of the grade road where the coffee shop is now. It used to be a chicken place and, changes all the time. The foundry, I'm sure you're all familiar with the foundry. You had a question?
I wanted you to turn the lights off.
Oh, it would show better probably, wouldn't it? Yes. So the foundry had a lot of owners. I know we always think of it as the Demers foundry, but it was actually Worcester, where Mrs. Whittle's family, the Woosters, if I'm right, your Bartus and Woosters, right, Nancy? I think he might have been probably one of the first ones here, but it went through a lot of hands. The buildings that we saw before they took down weren't all the originals. They looked original, they looked old, but most of those buildings burned in 1937 and the foundry was rebuilt then. And if any of you lived in Angels, do you remember that whistle at noon and that stinky smoke that came up? You could count on that every day at noon, then the whistle would blow and that dirty smoke would come up in the air. You can see the foundry buildings there. The one in the middle is the stone building that the foundation, it's got some walls back at the back of the Save Mart lot. You can see over on the left, all those buildings weren't there then. Another picture. And this is from when it burnt down, July 3rd newspaper, 1937, it burnt down. Not the stone building, of course, but a lot of them did. That's the inside of the foundry. Looking at it, it had to have been fairly early, and some of those kids look like kids. I mean, they look like children working in that place. This is from a family album. It's behind the foundry. You can see all the wood at the left, because they were burning wood to keep that, going. And that building over there at the left is what we always called the Monteverdi house. It was actually Mr. Demarest, of course, first. I don't know any of the men in the building. I'm pretty sure one of them is a Miller, because this is the Miller's family albums I have, but I don't know who. None of them have any names on those photos. Again, this is the foundry sitting outside. The kid sitting up there on the left, on the upper one, that's Billy Raggio, because I do know that had a name on it, but the other men, I don't know who they are. This house was built for Demarest in 1887. Eventually, Lawrence Monteverdi bought the foundry and the house. I'm sure some of you remember when they moved the house in 1985, down the road. It was a pretty interesting thing to watch, and a massive job. And it's sitting on, is it Mark Twain or Stanislaus up there behind U.S. Mark Twain? This one is the Altaville Hotel. Like I said, it's the corner of the Murphy's Grade Road. It was originally owned by John, well, actually, he bought it from Thomas Fraser. Thomas Fraser had it in the very early years. John Warden, his wife, bought it, added on to it. There was a dance hall behind it on the back. They owned a lot of land around it. And when they bought it, the deed said, except in the cabin built by some Italian, the name unknown. That's another picture of it, a little bit of a close-up. The Grade Road, I'm not sure if that little building that has the roof hanging out might be the same as that little order service, or if they knock that down and build a new one. That is Mrs. Ward. She ran that after John died. Then she went down and worked at the Stockton Insane Asylum for a while. Then she came back up and built a little house up here and lived here until she died. And that is what was on with it. Oh, you all remember Jack's Place, I'm sure. That's where the Altaville Hotel was. It was Pat's Place before that, Patricia Sepanich, and they called it Pat's Place for her, then Jack's Place. And I don't remember, that was a restaurant on the right-hand side, I think, back then, but I don't remember what it was. But this was all torn down in 1990. And I think the first building that was put up there was a fried chicken place, maybe. Kentucky Fried Chicken maybe replaced it. I think that's what it was. The Altaville Brick School. That was built in with donations from the people. They had a big ball down at the Prince Building. And it was put on by the ladies of Angels Camp and Altaville because they all felt that the kids should have a school. And so the ladies got together and put on the ball and built that school. In 1939, the state school people said the children should not be in that building. It's falling down. It's going to fall down on their heads. They said the mortar was like sawdust. By the way, our county archives building's the same way now. I think it's going to fall on our heads. And so you'd have thought they'd have done something. It took them 10 more years before they took those children out of that school. which doesn't say much for, and luckily it didn't fall down on their heads. At one point, well, I guess you all know that school building used to be at the back of the lot, and it was taken apart and moved and put back together. So when they had too many pupils, they built the wood building in front of it. They did the same thing up at Murphy's. When the school, the historic school, the wood one, got overcrowded, they built another building next to it and then later took it down. And this, of course, is Mark Twain's school. The brick school was not used after 1949. They had built a 3-room school on the grounds where Mark Twain is now. And then Angels Camp also needed a new school. And so they asked to unify, and they said they would pay for the rest of the classrooms that it would need. And so this campus opened the bigger campus opened in 1953. And it's been, added on to since. This is the first high school. I don't know if you know why there's a high school in Angels Camp. They had a bond issue for a county high school. There was no high school. And it passed. Everybody was, wanted a high school for their kids, because otherwise you send them to the city. They boarded. But they didn't build it here, and the people of Angels and Altaville thought they'd build it here. They built it in San Andreas. Well, they didn't build it in San Andreas. They put them in the fraternal hall. So the people of Angels and Altaville got together, and they all pledged the money and built their own high school. So everybody in these two communities went to this high school, and everybody in any other community in the county went to San Andreas. For years and years and years and years, you went right through here and past the high school until they finally got that. This one lasted until 1926. And then they opened the new one. This is the curriculum for the new one. In the first year, you could either take the literary scientific courses or the commercial course. The literary scientific would be going on to a university, and you notice they have language, they take Latin. The second year is about the same, the commercial course, but by the third year, those kids who took the commercial course must have been sent out to get jobs, because they don't have a commercial course in the third and fourth year. And you took 2 languages in the junior year. You chose Latin or German and French or Spanish. And I'm always floored that they could do that, and we can't do that today. There's no reason why our kids today couldn't learn what they... I don't know if any of you, I've got a newspaper clipping with the 8th grade graduation test that you had to take. Most of us couldn't pass it. And they were teaching in one-room schools. Really educated the kids. Fascinating. So here's the school, which we all remember, that opened in 1926. Big campus. Had quite a bit of land behind it. And this is what happened to it, of course, eventually, when it burnt down in 1994, which I think most of us remember that night too. The Serbian church. That was built, opened in 1909. See the building behind it? That's the Grand Bakery. It seems kind of a strange, knowing where the Serbian church is now, it seems like a strange spot. There's a good picture of it. It opened in 1912, 3 years after the church started. St. Patrick's Church was the third Catholic church. The first Catholic church was where the mortuary is in Angels. The second Catholic church, St. Columbo's, was on Bush Street. And this was the third one that they built. And that spire, I think they have, over to the right-hand side of the church, I think is where that spire was. I remember when they built it that they were, wanted to remember where that was. The house you see on the left is one of the mine manager's houses. The little building, excuse me, the little building on the right is a parsonage. And according to the stories, that was the St. Columbo Church building. They took it apart, moved it here, and used it, used it for the parsonage, which would be normal because you don't waste things. You move the building and this hasn't been that long, 2016 when it burned down. This was built in 1900 for Eli Price. He was a school teacher in a lot of our schools. He had quite a large family. He didn't finish the house for years. The tax thing for about 15 years said unfinished house. And unfortunately, it burned down, of course, in 2016. This is his family. Unfortunately, about 1912, Mr. Price started drinking. He'd probably been drinking long before that. And they sent him to the Stockton Insane Asylum, which is where you sent for drying out. I have one, thank you very much. One of his sons, the oldest one, became a judge in Alpine County. But Clarence, one of the kids, he lost in 1933, 3 of his children died in Angels Camp from starvation. But they found out, how bad it was. The people brought food to them, but they couldn't save those 3 children. Probably, not too many jobs, and that was after the Depression. And there, our museum. The tractor there is not, that one's, that's the other one. The big one, the other one, I'm sorry, I should have put a separate picture of that one, was up in Sheep Ranch area. And Carl Mills, who was the fairgrounds manager for quite some years, he told them that the owner would give it to them. So they took Mr. Carley's tow wagon, they went up there, they towed it down here, came into town making a big thing out of it. They lit the fire in the boiler before they came into town, so it'd be smoking. The problem was that the owner had not told him he could have him. He was going to have them all arrested for stealing his tractor, but they allowed him to keep it. This one was up on McKay's property, the one that's in the picture. That building, look at the difference in how it looks today from the picture on the right, the picture on the left, then how wonderful it looks today. Why isn't that moving? There we go. This is one of the ladies that lived down in almost on the line where Angels Camp was, and this was very early, 1857. Wife beating was not unusual. It's probably not unusual today either. I don't know why I said it that way, but the people of the town, the men, protected women who got beat too much. They set up a committee. They decided he was to go, and I think, how much did they give him? By 6 o'clock on Friday, he was to leave the camp and never return. That happened up in Murphy's as well. They set up a committee in the early 1850s about, actually the lady who bought the Murphy's Hotel in years earlier, Elizabeth Mitchell, and they threw her husband out of town too. It's nice to know that there was some protection. Purdyville, there's not any photos really much of Purdyville, even though it's an important part of the Altaville community. That's the only one I know of, and I honestly don't know whose house is because you can't tell, where they are. That's Mrs. Caper's boarding house. She was obviously, there's only one woman in this picture, and she looks quite young, but I have to assume it's her. She was actually given guardianship of young girls who would be Austrian girls who were abused. So she must have been an upright citizen of the community, because there were several court cases where what often happened is, say dad owed a debt, he would sell his young daughter to the man in marriage. And in a lot of cases, the young girl would start screaming and shouting and yelling, and the police would get involved. And she would often be made the guardian of those children. So obviously, she was there's the Purdyville School. Again, we don't know any of their names. That's the house down in front of Swenderman's. It's still sitting there, the old Swenderman Hardware. That was Elizabeth Ward's, the owner of the Altaville Hotel. That's the little house she built in 1897 and lived in. It was going to be moved, but didn't. Oh, I'm going to say I don't know what's going on, but it's still under consideration, I guess. I just threw this one in Monty's Inn. I know you've all seen that old building outside of Angels Camp. That was a big dance hall. That's all that's left of it, and it is going to be gone to the ground in probably another year or so. It's really getting bad this year. But that was one of the biggest dance halls around. So Angels Camp. I'm guessing this is maybe 1890 or so. Very few of those buildings are still there because Angels Camp had fires every few years and kept wiping out their business district. This is Henry Angel. By the way, in case anybody thinks there was a George Angel, there wasn't a George Angel. I know they've got them written in things. There was no George Angel. At one point in 1860 census, Henry Angel had James Angel living with him. They were 4 years apart, both born in the same state. Could have been a brother or a cousin, but that's the only time he had anybody else with him. And this is a clip-in. He left in 1848 and sold his trading post to John Scribner. And this says, he had a store in the camp, and he had a log cabin that was situated near where the Scribner store is. His trading post wasn't where the Scribner store, which has been written in most books. His trading post was on this side of the creek, right next to the creek. In 1855, they had the first big fire, wiped out everything, all the way through downtown. Nothing basically was left. There are books that have said that the Catholic Church on the mortuary lot burnt, but there was nothing in any newspaper that said that church burnt. And there was a Catholic church there the next year. I don't think St. Michael's Church burned. I think it just didn't get up that far, but we can't prove it. And next year we did it again. The Angels Hotel was called the Lake Hotel. And when he rebuilt, he built of wood. So the very next year, his hotel caught fire again, took out 2 buildings next to it, and after that he built a stone building, which he probably should have done in the first place. Third big fire was 1885. It started in the Cosgrove Hotel, which was on the west side of Main Street, about halfway down. The newspaper said they had an insane person in the room and he started the fire. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Destroyed everything between the Scribner Stone Store and Lot 9, well, Lot 10, where there was another stone store, which was Scribner's warehouse. So that whole section was gone, and there's no building in that section that was before 1885. And also, that all burnt twice more, the same section. So all the buildings in there are newer than 1931. Mostly the Bazinet Hotel, the Bank of America building, because they took up most of the lots that were burned. But there's nothing there that's before 1900. This is the next big one, 1894. Started on the same side, the west side, burned it to the ground, and took out, let's see, the Stockton Lodging House, Marshall Saloon, the Golden Eagle Hotel and Bakery, Swain's Jewelry Store, Jack's Hardware Store, Ratz's Barbershop, Mrs. Crook's Lodging House, Burner's Cigar Store, a saloon, Otto Fletcher's, and William Smith's Lodging House, and also went across on the east side of Main Street and damaged buildings, the Angels Hotel and other buildings on that side. So a lot of that stuff, like I said, they're not as old as we think they are because of the fires that they had. Here's another one, 1923, hit again on the same side, west side of town, and took out, let's see, the Angels Theater. That first theater on that side had been built in 1912, so in 1923 that theater, same place where the theater is now, burnt that out and all the stores around it. Now this one is a little off. It's the 1931 fire that took out 5 lots in that block. It said the landmarks immortalized by Mark Twain. Well, obviously they weren't. They've all been burnt 5 times, so they're nothing to do with, But it burnt, like I said, it took out lot 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And most of the time there was not much insurance on these things. This one, I don't know if you know that the Congregational Church has closed down a week ago. And so the history of this could very easily get lost if we don't watch it. That lot was the burial ground, the public burial ground of Angels Camp. It was the only early burial ground in Angels Camp. And then there was a Union Church up on Summit Road that had been built in the 1850s. It was getting really, really bad. So they put one on the back of the burial ground. You can see it on the left-hand picture behind the Congregational Church. And then the Congregational Church was built on the burial ground. And you notice that there are gravestones still there. I have a nasty feeling about how many people are buried there. Mrs. Jackson, Almina Jackson, died in the early 1850s in childbirth, and so did her baby. She was buried there, and there's no marker. How many others are in that ground that never had a marker? Because most of the early ones, at the best, they had wood, and in some cases, nothing. And you can see how many markers. I am guessing if the marker's there, the body's there. So there's probably a lot of people still there. This is the 1855 Catholic Church. Like I said, it was on the mortuary lot. It was there where the parking lot is, not where the building is. The building's a different lot. And it was called St. Michael's. They used that until the church on the left up on Bush Street, St. Columbo's, was built. They built it about 1890 on what is now called the Douglas subdivision. Then around 1900, and it wasn't that old, that church wasn't, the new priest that came and thought, because it was mining ground and he thought it might collapse, he insisted that they build another church somewhere else and stop using that. And so they built the St. Patrick's Church on, well, not this lot, that lot, over there. St. Columbo's was, like I said, it was a neat little building, and it wasn't used for long. Did you know that you had the first airport in the county? Yes. Opening day, Carlo Airport, June of 1929. It wasn't in the city. It was on, does anybody know where Saunders Ranch is in Vallecito? Right before Red Hill Road, the Saunders were. It was on leased land from Elmer Saunders. It was paid for by the Boosters Club. The Boosters Club in Angels Camp basically ran the city. The city council would turn to them anytime they needed something. The boosters would raise the money, because when you became a city, you really didn't have any money, and they wanted to really do things as soon as they became a city. So the Boosters Club, the things they did, not just for Angels, but for the whole county. They started the winter sports up at Big Trees. They brought thousands of people up in the 1930s to play in the snow in a place that didn't even have a highway up that was worth anything. They were absolutely tremendous, what those men did. And they gave you the first airport in the county. Surprised me, I had no idea. They had a pilot school there. One of the first was a woman that signed up to get her pilot's license, well, a young woman. They had airplane tour companies that would bring them here, and they would go visit Moaning Cave, and then they'd fly them home. Pretty big thing for 1930s. Also, your first pool. The pool was where the pool was, and that isn't changed. But the first thing I found about it was the article in the newspaper that said somebody stole the pool. I was thinking, how do you steal a swimming pool? It was put in 1925 by the Boosters Club. It was 300 foot long and 50 foot wide, 12 foot deep at the deepest end. And I'm wondering, did they dig that by hand, or did they have equipment in 1925 that did it? But the bottom was left mud, and the walls were lined with 12-inch cedar planks. And over the winter of 1928, somebody stole all the cedar planks. So all there was a hole in the ground left. The picture on the left, I'm pretty sure, is that wood-lined pool. The second one is the next pool that they opened Fog Jump Weekend, May of 1934. And then the last picture is, kind of like it was when they finally just closed it down. And until I know the boosters were still paying for that pool in the 1960s. Somewhere it went to the Angels Veterans Memorial District after that. I know it couldn't have gone to them before that because they didn't exist before that, and I know that the boosters were still doing it. This is where the Angels Theater is. This is lot 15 in block 3. And you wouldn't have thought that there would be a big lumberyard down there on Main Street. But there is. It was owned by William Hanford Hill. He sold it to Kimball and Cudden and Dickinson. They sold it to Manuel and eventually owned up by Mr. Fletcher, John Fletcher of Angels Camp. That had to, with the wagons hauling the logs down and all the wood, and people going in and out to get that wood, that had got to have been a dangerous location and difficult to get around. So after it finally was sold, they put that first movie theater in 1912. It wasn't very big. As I said, it burnt in 1923. And then the picture on the left, by the way, is the Stickle Theater. That was a dramatic, it was not a movie theater. The picture in the middle is the first movie theater. It was built next to the Calaveras Hotel in 1908. And you can actually, if you blow up that picture, you can read the movies that they had. The picture on the right is the inside of the 1912 movie theater that burnt down in 1922. And then here's the interior of the theater, the one that was rebuilt in 1924. And that is how it looked on the outside during the Frog Jump weekend. It was built again, opened in 1939. It burnt down in 1954 and stayed closed until 1967. So there was a big gap of 13 years where the building just sat there damaged, and then it looks now, well, not the inside because they've really fixed up the inside, but the outside looks the same now as it did when it reopened. Here's the Angels Hotel. As I said, it belonged to Charles Lake. He built it after the second fire. The left-hand side looks like it's part of the hotel. That was the IOF building. They owned the ground, and they owned the upper floor, but they sold the bottom floor to retail businesses. It's kind of like a condo association building or something. So when Mr. Lake built his stone hotel, the deed said that they would be able to use the party wall as a shared wall for the new hotel. That IOF building caught fire during the 1885 fire. They had black powder. The retail business had black powder stored in the basement. The fire got to the black powder and blew the building up. So the IOF building that you see now is 2 lots down and was built after that 1885 fire. Don't pay any attention to the dates on those old buildings. They say the date, but it's from when the IOF first started, for instance, not from when that building was built. This is how it looked in 1880, kind of barren. That's in 1890, 10 years later. And that's kind of, more like what it looks today, missing a few parts on it, but it went through quite a few hands. The bartender that told that story to Mark Twain about the Jumping Frog, Russ Kuhn, he owned it. He sold it to Dr. Jones of Murphy's. They changed the name to the Union Hotel. And then it became Otto Fletchens, and finally, of course, the Heinz family and the Lemurs had bought it. And this is Mr. Scribner's store. It's the only good old shop we have. And it's not the upper part, it's just the lower that was his store. If you see that building, you see down on the right-hand side, it looks different. The Woodses bought the lot and built the whole building around that little Scribner store. And the Woods building, the same thing, had, up on the top there was an opera hall, there were doctor's offices, retail all the way along the bottom. And it burnt down. 1941, if I remember correctly, so it's now the city parking lot where that is. That building looks a lot bigger than that parking lot, but it clearly wasn't. This is the John Scribner home. It had been built earlier, but in 1867, the original home burnt to the ground, and Scribner's partner, Captain Henry Matthews, died in the fire. They immediately rebuilt. That's the house that Scribner's rebuilt. And this is how it looks today on the right. That's one of the nicest, upkeeps on an old house that we have in the town. When John Scribner died, his widow, Susan, got everything, and he had a lot of money. And then when she died, not that long after, she left her money to her nieces and nephews in England. Except they weren't her nieces and nephews, they were her children. She had left her husband and her children and ran off with a boarder, came to America. Then she married a man. I don't know what she did with the guy she ran off with. Married a man, and when he died, she married Scribner. But she was still married to the first husband when she married the second, and we don't know if she was a bigamist when she married Scribner or not. And we don't know if Mr. Scribner knew that his wife had ran off and left her family and married several times. No idea. But it was interesting. It all came out in the newspapers after she died that she wasn't who they thought. This is the Sam Choi store in Chinatown. Sam Choi was the best known of the Chinese gentlemen that owned any businesses at all. He actually had a store on Main Street at one time, and there was another Chinese store on the other side of Main Street for a while, but most of them, of course, were in Chinatown. He would stay until he started selling right about 1900. He had most of his stuff was gone by 1902 or so. They built a second floor on it, and they turned it into a brothel. I guess I'll call it. I'm trying to think of the right word. A brothel will do. And it stayed with the second floor. The ladies' rooms were up. There was a big description on how it worked. There's a small dance hall down on the bottom floor and a parlor. And the ladies' rooms were upstairs. The lady of the house also served the upstairs rooms. Her name was Lottie Smith. It was owned by Mr. Monteverdi. And so, of course, when about 1914, 1915, when they said we're not having these places anymore, he got arrested, so did she, and so did 4 other houses in Chinatown. Strangely, they didn't close the Banana Ranch down then. That was later. And then they took off that second floor, the city bought it and turned it into a jail. This is the original Calaveras Hotel. Not that big building that you've all seen pictures of. That was what the Calaveras Hotel was when it was purchased. It was built by a young woman, and I don't know, kind of unusual. She built it on Alexander Love's land, and then later she bought part of his land that the building was on, and Mrs. Valeri, who was widowed, purchased it from her. Then Mrs. Valeri bought this little spot to the left and put the meat market there. And this is what it eventually, the round roof building is that first movie house. It was turned into all kinds of a plumbing store, a hardware store. You can kind of see the peak in the middle that was the original Calaveras Hotel. And she has added every building all the way down to Scrabble Lane. And this lodging house that was on the right-hand side, she added that as well. And, no, I must have missed, there. Why is it going back and forth? That's how it looked after the December 1938 fire. Nothing left of it. They did have one death in the building when it burnt down. That lot stayed empty for a lot of years. This building I like. This is still there, you can recognize it. It was built by a jeweler who had his jewelry store in the left-hand side, the lower, the one-story side, on that empty lot in front of the stable. We have a lot of ghost stories in this county, and usually they are a hotel. It's haunted. It's got this I mean, they say the Darlington Hotel has, Rebecca Darlington Gardner in it. I don't know why they think that. She didn't live up there very long, and she lived down here and died here. But this one, I wondered why no one thinks that's not haunted. In 1901, a young woman, Sadie, took a room there. She met the man she was engaged to and had dinner across the road at the Central Park Hotel. During that evening, she returned his ring because he refused to marry her, and she went back to her room. And the next morning was seen on the hill up above that Reba building, the lodging house. And the person who saw her said she took something and put it to her mouth like she was drinking. And then she came down the hill, and in front of the stable that you can just barely see behind it, the barn's still there, she fell to the ground. And the stable hand called the man, Matt Zwing, who she had been engaged to, and he came and he carried her up to her room, and she died. She had a note pinned on her dress, how he refused to marry her, and he knows what condition I'm in. She also said that she had in her trunk flowered material that was intended for her wedding dress, and they should wrap her in it to bury her. They should take her body to her uncle's house down in the annex and call her mother. And if anybody's going to haunt anything, she should be haunting that place. And yet no one's ever said that that place is haunted. That recently sold, by the way, a young couple with a lot of ambition, we hope. There's the newspaper story on her. He will not marry me. He knows the condition I have him. They have disgraced me by saying I'm crazy, but I'm not. Only he has fooled me. And I don't know if Matt Zwing had any embarrassment about this, but he certainly should have had. Now this is where the post office and the Mel's Corner, well, it's not Mel's Corner anymore, but the bar and the hotel, the Central Park Hotel are now. The left-hand building was George Young's office. He somehow became an attorney, and when he came here it was mine, and he turned into an attorney. Dr. Boone's office was next to his. Dr. Boone had his house behind, and William Mays owned this little cottage that was on the corner. And that is what's there now. The Central Park Hotel was bought, it wasn't there. The lady from, Mrs. Slebitz from Murphy's bought it. She'd been widowed, and she came down and she bought the house that was there, built the hotel. Then she sold it to Eliza Perry, who was the owner of the hotel in Murphy's. She was Eliza Perry before she'd remarried into Nathaniel Hoyt. When she died, her husband and her sister inherited the hotel, and eventually it got turned into Central Park. That hotel, during the flu epidemic in the 1918s, was turned into a Red Cross hospital and was used for that in Angels Camp. There was a Native American who was Jeff Davis's son, Ike. The Red Cross people were going out, checking on people who were ill, and they brought him down to the hospital. He did not want to come. Native Americans would not want to come down to Angels Camp and be in a hospital. He jumped out of the window and was found about a week later dead out, south of town. Eventually, they built this. There were 3 wood buildings to the left of it. Then they built the building you can see in this picture with the little peaked roof, which is now where the post office is. And that is not a stone hotel. That is a stone face and put on a wood building. That wall looks like it is, but it is definitely, it was a wood building based later. The Stickle store buildings are still standing. The big, tall, 2-story one was the second one built. I kind of have a feeling this might have been a grand opening with all these people outside it, which would make it about 1896. The building to the right is the original Stickle store, which is now Stories and Stones. You can see the original Stickle store and how it looks today. And there the two are side by side. It turned into the garage. And still is a garage, building, basically. The Stickles owned a lot of land to the north of that. In 1900, they sold part of it to the new Calaveras County Bank. Then they sold the rest of it with the buildings that were on it to another man. He took down the one next to the bank and built what is now Turner's. And the other two buildings were there. They're the original buildings. That one to the left is corrugated iron. One of those, I'm trying to remember which one of those two. One of them was the pickle patch for years. Pickle barrel, yes, the pickle patch was in. This is John Pirano's store. It was down by the creek where the Century 21 office is now. I think it's still Century 21. He had married a young girl, Julia Podesto. Big stone building. He had first been living over on the other side of the creek. And after he got married and as they started having children, he built a stone house behind it. That house is still standing. That's John Pirano. He was described as being reddish-haired, blue-eyed, and small in stature. The building was taken down in 1938, so a gas station could be built there. A lot of you probably remember that gas station. It was taken down in, I'm going to say 1972, and they built Fidelity Bank, which is the same building where Century 21 is now. That is Joseph Pirano's store. It is still standing across from, up at this end of town, across from what was the visitor center. Look at the road. You see how that building's right flat to the road? There's no steps up, and the house is the same way. After they paved the road, see the difference? It's left, they graded it down so far that that was left up high on a bank. The house is still there. See underneath, there's just two doors. That's how it looks today. Mr. Pirano died in 1896. My daughter married into this family. She married into it. There were 5 girls, all Italians, and 4 of them married Italians. The last one married a Miller, and she married the Millers. So this was an uncle's, great-great-uncle's house. The Jumping Frog Jubilee, I'm sure you know that they started it after they graded and oiled the road. They say paved, but it really wasn't paved at that time. And so they started doing the Jubilees in town. You can see the stores on the left hand, the theater and where the post office is now. I don't have a real good shot of what they have hanging across, but they hung moss at first, and they had flat cutouts of frogs that hung up there. Then later they went to what I'll call pennants tied across different colored flags. And they, I'm sure I've got the very first program from the very first 1928 because the family gave me all their old stuff. And then of course they moved down to the, wasn't to where it is now, but they moved onto the Canoper property in 1938. And then moved on to what was the Angels racetrack a couple of years later and started adding buildings. The Mark Twain statue, you see the frogs up on it? They were vandalized and removed. They're not there anymore. But that was put in 1944, June Frog Jump weekend, and the gate had an ore car up on the top. And this is what the park looked like back then, 1940s, when it was first done. Very rustic. It was put, Boosters Club again, and the Ladies Club, and the trees were all donated. The Bret Harte High School students drew up designs for the landscaping, and there was a contest to see which one would be chosen. They said they bought George Angel's log cabin down there, but we all know there wasn't a George Angel, and his log cabin would have burned in the 1855 fire anyway, so they didn't bring his, I don't know what it was they brought down. They did bring a log cabin, but it definitely wasn't, from George Angel. And this is before the 1931 fire. Every one of those buildings, from where those 2 phone poles are, down, burnt, and the buildings here from the one you can barely see, all of them up on that side of the road, burned. And here's the Bazinet Hotel. It was built in 1937 on 4 of the 5 lots. You can see the 5th lot to the right is still vacant, lot 9. The building to the left is the one where the Scribner store was that the Woods built their hall around. It burned in 1941. And here's how it looked after lot 9 had the B of A building on it. This is one of these livery stables, the one further up. This was made into the Carley's garage. And here's Mr. Carley's carpenter work in addition to undertaking. So like I said, you could have him build your house or you could have him bury you. It didn't make any difference to him. And that was his early garage out of the livery stable. They converted one of the trucks into school bus. They converted another one into a mortuary car. I mean, they really ran a lot of the things around here. That's a picture of, said it was brand new, 1937. That building really hasn't changed that much since then. And now, this is the Veterans Building. I have seen tourists taking pictures of that building. I think they think it's antique. It was actually built in the late 1960s. It does look like it, it did a really good match for, and this was what was there in 1929. You see how really, really awful those buildings were in 1929? The town had, in some parts of it, had really got pretty decrepit back then. And that's where the Veterans Building is now. Which one is this one? Oh. One of those buildings where the Veterans Building was had all kinds of retail businesses. Henry Arnett, who was a candy maker, had a business in there. And in 1897, he had a young wife, 15 years old. And they obviously hadn't got along. She had left him and been gone for several months. She'd only come back a few days. According to the newspaper, she asked him to give her $25, and it enraged him. And he took an axe and hit her several times. The witness, which was a cousin of the girls, ran for help. They heard gunshots. He'd shot himself. He had ran up to another house and hid in the basement. They were going to lynch him. I mean, that's what the men were planning, but the doctor said he was going to die anyway, so they didn't. He lived. He went to a prison and died there. This is his wife, Louise, in the picture. Like I said, some of these buildings have got such sad stories that go with them. The Mercantile, now this one I'm going to look up because I want to actually remember. Well, you can stay down there. Because the first owner of this building was Sam Choi, the Chinaman, which is very unusual for a Chinese store to have been on Main Street, not in Chinatown, and Sam Choi had a building here. Let me look that up because it went through a lot of hands. Mr. Hockman got the building. It was a 2-story building, and he had a skating rink in it. The article says the first regular skating carnival at Hockman's skating rink occurred last Saturday. There were 200 or more there. They listed some of them they were all in fancy dress, obviously, and they listed several of them who were the most outstanding in their dress. The second one they listed was Miss Maggie Miller, who wore a jaunty little dress of white cashmere covered with knots and bows of red ribbon and a magic wand in her hand. This happens to be the family my daughter married into. We had a picture of her in that outfit, Maggie Miller. She later married, this was 1872. In that year, she married the son of the man who owned the Bovey mine up here in Altaville. And they went to San Francisco. He only lived 2 years. A few years later, she married an actor, William Dugnan. He only lived until 1885. She then married a comedian. I couldn't trace her until all of a sudden I found her death.
She was back here with her parents. They had had a separation. He was in Chicago performing on the stage. She wanted to go back and reconcile with him, so she went to Chicago. He didn't know she was coming. She thought because he didn't meet her that he didn't want her, and she swallowed carbolic acid. That's the only reason I was able to trace Maggie, is because she killed herself in Chicago, and it had a little article in our local newspaper about Maggie Miller, who was born here, has died in Chicago. They eventually put a bowling alley in the Mercantile building. It had 4 alleys and a ping pong table, a soft drink and candy stand, and a comfortable setup of seats. That was in 1942. The Angels Annex is the area south of town where they're kind of up on a hill. On the right-hand side, and I know you can't really see it, there's a big park called the Angels Annex Park. It was also called the Fairfax Park because it's built on top of the Fairfax plaza mine that was down there. This is all done by the Utica Mining Company, probably for housing, for their miners to buy. The lots were $100. They didn't sell all that well. The ones along the highway, the main street did, but the ones up on the bank, a lot of them never had any houses on them at all. That's the kind one of the houses that was out there. Fairfax, they called it Fairfax Park in the bigger thing. They built a pavilion out there. It had a ballpark. They had all kinds of things going on out there, all kinds of events. This is in 1897. They had a ball there in 1897 on August. They had a merry-go-round there the same week. And I have one picture. This is the Angels Miners Band, and that's the pavilion they built. The gentleman on the right in the front row is John William Henry Miller. The fourth from the right in the back row is, I just lost his first name, Stone, Charlie Stone. I don't know the names of any of the other, but they're all local Angels Camp men. There could be ancestors of any of you that are here. We got so few houses that still look like the same. This is right down there on the highway at the creek. It was Dr. Pasha's house. You can see how it looked years ago, except for the fact it looks a lot better now. Not much difference. Next to it was John A. Piranda's home. Same thing, hasn't changed all that much at all. Side-by-side views that still, like I said, you'd certainly know what house it was. This is the Utica Hospital. It was built in 1894 after there was a lot of outcry because there were so many accidents in that mine and there was nowhere for the men to be taken care of, so they built this, a modern hospital at the time on Dr. John Dora's lot. It still stands. It's pretty run down. This is the first fire department. It was down there about building south of where the Veterans Building stands. That is only a 14 by 15 foot building, and they had the fire truck in there. The man that sold it to them, his purchase price was that he would not have to pay to put the fire lines to his property. They must have made a rule that everybody had to run lines and you had to pay for it, and so he sold them. This is the second Masonic Hall. It's on the same lot as the old Masonic Hall was, but during the fire of 1894, it spread back onto Bush Street and burnt the front of the building. So in 1897, they built this building. It's a private residence now, but it's still in good condition. This is running outside of town. This is what everybody calls the Mamagi building, which is almost down to the ground. The two on the right are James and Louisa. I don't have any idea of who the lady standing is. This is how it looked in better days. It was right on the road, and they did move the road over because it was not a good idea. The Miller family, Maggie Miller's family, lived 100 yards from there. And I've always wondered if that house down there was their house. I'll never know, but they were 100 yards from the Margie's home. Over the years, Utica Mansion changed greatly over the years because they added on, put a veranda in, et cetera, so it's changed quite a bit. The depot, which obviously is gone. The bands changed uniform constantly. Miners' band, that would have been probably in the 1940s, 1950s. The two bridges, the one on the right is the one that goes towards Sonora. That was built after the flood of 1909. I cannot find a date from when the bridge and Vallecito Road were put in, but I know it was after 1947 because they took the property they needed by eminent domain. And the people didn't like what they were offered, and they sued for more money. And by the way, won. They never do offer what. So I know it was put in after 1947, but I haven't been able to find anything on the exact dates of when, which meant that road was not there. I don't know if you realize that you went up Bird's Way, and then right above, it crossed to the right, crossed the creek, and went up. This was all built when that bridge was built, and that's why they had to take all the property, because they didn't have any property for a road. Angels Brewery, that was outside of town. There's still one old building there. Not this building, but there was the old, probably a barn from the ice works part of it. This was the Los Muertos Saloon. It belonged to the Miller family, and then the Pequeninos bought it. It burnt down in 1952. It was not that far south of Angels Camp, almost across from where the Park Street goes down to where the park used to be. And that is Maggie Miller, the second Maggie Miller. Every generation has a Maggie Miller. She's the second Maggie Miller there, standing up on that porch. And there we are.